What's interesting about the title, Russia in the Mediterranean, the naval theatre for Armageddon, I think draws attention to an aspect of the Battle of Armageddon that perhaps we don't normally focus on. And what we're suggesting here is that the Battle of Armageddon is both a land but also a sea battle. And it's that latter aspect that's going to be the basis for our investigation in this afternoon session. Now, our study really begins with an examination of one of the key passages in the Old Testament which warned of God's impending judgments. What were the two great chapters that warned about God's coming judgments? And the answer is Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28. We're going to go to Deuteronomy 28 just to draw your attention to a couple of things mentioned in that chapter to begin with, and it's going to set the framework really for our whole investigation in the study to come, because you'll know that that chapter is full of the blessings and the cursings. If they obeyed God, they would be blessed, but if they disobeyed God, then these curses would come upon them. And in the list of things to come upon them, we're told this in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and reading from verse 48. And the record says, "Therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies, which Yahweh shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favour to the young." You notice how expressive those terms are in those verses. A yoke of iron will this power be. One that comes as swift as the eagle. A power of fierce countenance. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. And that last expression, incidentally, indicated, I think, a power from so far away, a nation so totally foreign, that their speech would be completely unintelligible to the Jewish nation. Now, do you know there was an obvious application of these words in Deuteronomy to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon? Because we read, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 28, the record says, "I've put a yoke of iron upon the neck of all these nations, that they may serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon." But that's the words of verse 48 of Deuteronomy 28, is it not? And when Moses says here in verse 49, it will be a nation as swift as the eagle flieth, that's what the book of Habakkuk chapter 1 says, doesn't it? In verses 6 to 8, "I raise up the Chaldeans, and they shall fly as the eagle hasteth to eat." Likewise, when Moses says here that they will have a tongue which thou shalt not understand, Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 15 says, "Lo, I will bring a nation upon you from far, a nation whose language thou knowest not, neither understandest thou what they say." That's a reference to the power of Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 5. And when it says in verse 50 here of Deuteronomy that it will be a nation of fierce countenance which shall not regard the person of the old nor show favour to the young, well, that was really fulfilled by the Babylonians, wasn't it, in the 2nd of Chronicles 36, when it says that he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man, or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. So you see, really, the key terms of the prophecy were all outworked in Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Well, almost, but not quite. Because you see, what this chapter will go on to talk about later in terms of this king of fierce countenance was that firstly this power would besiege the gates of the cities of Israel, of which of course Jerusalem was the most preeminent, and certainly Nebuchadnezzar did that. He besieged their capital, did he not? But the chapter ends in verses 63 to 68 with a reference to the deportation of the Jews. Ye shall be plucked from off the land. Yahweh shall scatter thee among the people. Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, and there shall ye be sold unto your enemies. Now you see, Nebuchadnezzar did deport thousands of Jews from the Holy Land. We know that. They were taken in several waves to Babylonia, don't we? But he never fulfilled the terms of the last verse of Deuteronomy chapter 28 to send Jews away in ships. Those ships to deport Jews from the coast of Israel would need to be based in the Mediterranean Sea, but Nebuchadnezzar didn't have a navy there. In fact, he didn't have a navy at all. So the end of this prophecy wasn't really fulfilled finally in Nebuchadnezzar. There had to be one yet to come. Something more was required before the terms of Moses' last words would be fulfilled. Well, that takes us to the book of Daniel and to Daniel chapter 8. And you'll remember in Daniel 8 the story of the goat and the ram. And we're told this in Daniel chapter 8. It says, I might just pick up a little bit later than I intended, just to again save a little bit of time. Perhaps if we come to verse 20, the record there in Daniel 8 says, the ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goats the king of Grecia. And the horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So what we've got here is the story, of course, of the controversy between Media and Persia and the king of Grecia who came. And we're told, are we not, in verse 22, that first king being broken, 4 stood up for it. And of course, we've got a reference here, haven't we, brothers and sisters, to the 4 generals of Alexander who succeeded to his empire, consequent upon the death of Alexander. And so specifically what it says is that 4 stood up. And they were, of course, Lysimachus, who held Thrace and Asia Minor, Cassander, who held Macedonia and Greece, Ptolemy, who held Egypt and Phoenicia, and Seleucus, who held Syria and Babylonia. But out of one of those 4 generals, out of the territory of one of those 4 generals, Lysimachus, the Roman power would ultimately be seen. And that was the one who was going to wax towards the control of the Holy Land, as mentioned earlier in this chapter. And now verse 23 says, and in the latter time of their kingdom, which relates to the appearance of the Roman power, as Rotherham says, when transgressions have filled up their measure, there will come a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences. But you see, that phrase, a king of fierce countenance, is obviously an echo of the words of Deuteronomy chapter 28, are they not? A nation of fierce countenance will come against thee. So here's the promise of a king to come who will be a fulfillment again of the spirit of that curse to come in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Well, it was going to be the Romans, brothers and sisters, according to Daniel chapter 8. But if the Romans are introduced in Daniel 8 as a king of fierce countenance, come and see how the Romans are introduced in Daniel chapter 11, which really talks historically about the same period of time. It's in the time of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, when the Roman power came to prominence. But in Daniel 11, it describes it a little differently. Now, there's some history here, by the way. We're going to come to Daniel chapter 11 halfway through the chapter, but there was some history here because, you see, Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Seleucid kings, invaded Egypt with a naval force. He was going to advance his interests westward. But as he came westward along the African coast, he was finally stopped by the Romans who were advancing eastward. And they clashed in the Mediterranean because there was a battle for prominence. And it was partly a naval battle. Well, here's the entrance of the Romans in Daniel chapter 11, verse 30 it says. This is the moment when the Romans came into conflict with the Seleucids. And Daniel 11 verse 30 said, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. Now that ships of Kittim in Daniel 11 verse 30 is a reference to the Roman navy, who sent an ambassador from the Roman Senate to stop Antiochus in his tracks in Egypt. In fact, what had happened was Antiochus got there, he was about to take Alexandria, and suddenly part of the Roman navy turned up right on the beach, and out stepped a very elderly gentleman. He was a consul from the Roman Senate. His name was Gaius Popilius Lanus, and he stood on the beach and he said to Antiochus Epiphanes, "It is not the wish of the Roman Senate that you proceed any further. You must withdraw." And Antiochus Epiphanes said that he would think about the matter. And Gaius, to encourage him in his thoughts, took a stick on which he leaned, because he was an elderly man, and he drew a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes in the sand on the beach. And he said, "You will give me your answer before you step outside the circle." And Antiochus could not face the might of the Romans, and so he withdrew. Now, how significant in Daniel chapter 11 that the appearance of the Romans in history, as far as Daniel 11 is concerned, is signified by the arrival of their navy, you see. Their navy. The dramatic meeting on the beach. There was going to be another king of fierce countenance who would arrive in the form of the Roman power. And so that fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28 was seen in both the sacking of Jerusalem by Flavius Titus in AD 70 and by the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolution by Aelius Hadrianus in AD 132 to 135. The Romans became the king of fierce countenance, you see. Now, let me just show you one of those. I'm just going to take Aelius Hadrianus, and for a reason that shall become plain soon enough in our story this afternoon. You see, wasn't it Daniel chapter 2 who said, "The fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things"? So Moses' yoke of iron of Deuteronomy 28 was also the Romans, wasn't it? And where Moses had spoken of a nation that would come flying as swift as the eagle, hadn't Matthew 24 said, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth unto the west, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together"? And of course the Roman army that marched from the east marched under the very banner of a flying eagle. And Moses' words were fulfilled in the coming of the Romans. We're told in the book of John that at the time of the crucifixion of our Lord, it said, "This title then read many of the Jews, for Jesus was crucified nigh unto the city, and an inscription was written over him, which was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And if ever there was a tongue a nation whose tongue the Jews would struggle to understand, a strange speech and a harsh tongue, it was the Latin tongue, incomprehensible to the Jewish ear. Oh yes, they were a nation whose tongue Israel would not understand. And as for being of fierce countenance, won't Luke's gospel tell us that these be the days of vengeance, these be the days of great distress, these be the times of wrath upon his people, this is when they shall fall by the edge of the sword? And under the Romans, brothers and sisters, the affliction and the tribulation and the vengeance brought upon Jerusalem and the Jews was the worst it ever will be. That's part of the force, is it not, of the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24. Some of these things will never ever be exceeded again. The Romans did what Moses prophesied. They did not regard the person of the old or show favour to the young. They ploughed Zion as a field. They turned Jerusalem into heaps. And it was Hadrian who renamed the city Jerusalem. And what name did he call the city? Aelia Capitolina. Aelia was his own name. Aelia Hadrianus. Capitolina was one of the hills of Rome. Do you know, brothers and sisters, over 1 million Jews died in the siege of Titus, and over 500,000 died in the battles of Hadrian, and they were led away captive, as Luke 21 says. But let me talk about the leading away captive, because this is what happened, you see. There were indeed Roman deportations from Jerusalem. In AD 70, Titus sent 100,000 slaves by ships to work in the Egyptian mines. In AD 132 to 135, Hadrian sent several 100,000 slaves from Hadrian's market in Gaza by ships to the slave markets in Egypt. And really, when you think about it, that was Deuteronomy chapter 28, wasn't it? The last verse. And Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. In fact, do you know what the last verse really says? The last verse of Deuteronomy says, and Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships by the way whereof I spake unto thee, and thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. So how could they be sold for slaves and yet no man should buy them? And the answer was, fulfilled in what we see on the screen in front of us, is that Hadrian deported so many Jewish slaves that when they got to the markets they couldn't sell them all. So under the Romans then, the final verse of Moses' prophecy was fulfilled. They were deported in ships, Roman ships. And the reason why they could do that is because the Romans weren't just conquerors of the Jewish people, they dominated this region. And they did so partly, brothers and sisters, because of their naval power. So here's an extract from Wikipedia about the Roman naval power of the time. It says here, during the course of the First Punic War, the Roman navy was massively expanded and played a vital role in the Roman victory and eventual ascension to hegemony in the Mediterranean Sea. Rome went on to destroy Carthage and subdue the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean, achieving complete mastery of the inland sea, which they called Mare Nostrum. During the imperial period, the Mediterranean became largely a peaceful Roman lake. So this is the thing, you see, is that in the end, the Roman power dominated the whole of the Mediterranean region, and particularly in terms of their naval power. In fact, let me show you that on the map, just so you can see how pervasive the Roman influence was. So if we come across the Mediterranean from Spain, we've got the Iberian Sea, and we've got the Adriatic Sea, and we've got the Aegean Sea, and we've got the Euxine Sea. And so we've got this whole spread here, you see. And then we've got, well, here's some of the places, you see, of port facilities that the Romans had in the first 2 centuries AD. So there was Misenum near Rome. There was another port in Ravenna. There was one up on the African coast called Mauritania Caesarea. There was one down here in Lectus Magna, another one in Alexandria, another one in Seleucia Perea, another one in I've got to read that, Cyzicus, another one in Trapezus, and the last one in the reach of the Romans was this one here called Chersonesus Taurica. Now just tuck that away, that rather interesting title, Chersonesus Taurica, because, well, that's quite a significant place, as it will turn out to be in our study this afternoon. So would you say the Romans had naval dominance in that region? I think so. Absolute dominance. And that place, Chersonesus Taurica, was the farthermost naval facility the Romans had, the last outpost in their control of the region. And do you know why they called it Mare Nostrum? Because Mare Nostrum meant our sea. And there's the proof. They controlled it absolutely. Oh yes, it was theirs. The Roman power was absolute. Now, why that's all interesting, brothers and sisters, is because that can't be the fulfilment. That can't be the final fulfilment of the King of Fierce countenance of of Daniel chapter 8, because Daniel 8 tells us it can't be. Come and have a look. In Daniel chapter 8, it's absolutely clear that however the Romans might have fulfilled the terms of Deuteronomy 28, they can't be the last part of the story either, can they? Because, firstly, you'll notice that Daniel 8 verse 17 says, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid, and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." Or as the New King James Version says, the vision refers to the time of the end. So the king of fierce countenance has got to go long beyond the Romans. And is it really the time of the end? Absolutely, because look at verse 25. Through his policy he shall cause craft to prosper. But at the end of the verse it says that this king of fierce countenance will stand up against the prince of princes. But that's Christ. That's Christ that is coming. So there has to be a king of fierce countenance at the second coming of Christ. Well, that takes us to Ezekiel 38, because Ezekiel will describe for us the last battle against Israel, and he's going to name the king of fierce countenance, isn't he, that will accomplish that battle. Ezekiel 38, and since I know that you will all have a reasonable grasp of this rather obscure prophecy, I'm just going to draw your attention to one interesting piece of information about Ezekiel 38, which we all know so well. So verse 1, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of the Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. And so we know what our standard interpretation is, and I think, incidentally, it's absolutely sound, is that the Rosh of this chapter ought to be taken as a name, linguistically and philologically ought to be taken as a name, and that what we have here is a prophecy of Russia at the time of the end, and involved in what will be an invasion of the Middle East. But the only thing we wanted to draw attention to for purposes of this afternoon is that, you know, there's two groups in Ezekiel 38. There's what we might describe as the Russia group in verse 2 and verse 5 and verse 6, Russia, Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, Tagama. But there's a second group, isn't there, in Ezekiel 38 verse 13, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof. But you see, that Tarshish group in verse 13, well, you see, interestingly, Tarshish, you see, was a maritime power. We know that because the Bible says so. It was a maritime power. But you see, as a maritime nation, Tarshish had not only merchant ships, but a naval fleet. Trading on the high seas, incidentally, required both. They had ships of trade and ships of war to defend the ships of trade. You had to do both. If you wanted to trade successfully, you had to defend your goods. Now, if that group opposes Russia in Ezekiel 38, and they're a maritime power, then a reasonable conclusion from Ezekiel 38 is that one of the theatres of conflict is going to be a battle on the waters. The Tarshish group are known for their prowess on the seas. And if Russia is to succeed in this Middle East invasion, there's going to be a naval confrontation as well as a land-based encounter. And the theatre for that naval confrontation will be, we believe, in the Mediterranean, just as it was in Roman times. So is there any evidence that Gog will possess a naval fleet and use it in his invasion? And the answer is, well, yes, there is, isn't there? And in a famous passage. But before we come to the famous passage, let me just show you the relevance of this connection of thought between Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11, and between Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, so that we're satisfied that we really are talking about the same matters. I'm going to run through these so quickly that you'll be unable to take notes upon them. But you'll capture the idea, you see. So when we come to Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11, we find that their time for invasion and their place of origin are the same. We find that their vassal allies in the battle sequence are the same. We find that their devastating speed and overwhelming attack are the same. We find that their intention to plunder and spoil en route are the same. And we find that their exact position for sudden downfall are the same. And we suddenly realise that the Prince of Rosh of Ezekiel 38 is the king of the north of Daniel chapter 11. We know that, brothers and sisters, but it's as well to be reminded of it. But did you also realise this parallel here? That the man or king of Daniel 8 is also the king of Daniel chapter 11. Because you see, you will find that their time to embark upon a career of conquest is the same. And their hostility against the people of Israel is the same. And their intention to exterminate their enemies is the same. And their final destiny and irrevocable end is the same. And their determined but fatal opposition to the prince is the same. And we suddenly realise that the king of fierce countenance of Daniel chapter 8 is also the king of the north of Daniel chapter 11. So you see, the king of the north is Gog, the prince of the Russian host, and the king of the north is the last king of fierce countenance. Well, shall we come and have a look at him then, back in Daniel chapter 11, and just pick up the last few verses and see the significance of the connection that now, of course, we can make. Because we're talking about Russian naval power at the time of the end, and the theatre of that conflict being in the Mediterranean. So in Daniel chapter 11, we know these famous words in Daniel chapter 11 verse 40, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So this king of the north is the last king of fierce countenance, the prince of Russia. But I draw again to your attention that there are three destinations mentioned in the Middle East invasion by the king of the north. He's going to invade Turkey, that's the implications of verse 40. He's going to invade Israel, that's the implications of verse 41. And he's going to invade Egypt, that's the intention of verse 42. And I think he's going to use his navy for all three stages. This is not just a land mission. Russia will access her targets by sea as well, and the Mediterranean will be the theatre for that naval conflict. Now just notice what the record says in that 40th verse. It says that when he comes with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. Of course, you realise Daniel could have said that he comes with chariots and horsemen. It's a very common expression, that phrase, chariots and horsemen. It's used 35 times in the record, with chariots and horsemen, with chariots and horsemen. But Daniel didn't say with chariots and horsemen, did he? He said with chariots and horsemen and with ships. Do you know, brothers and sisters, this is the only place in Scripture where all three are found together. They are never found anywhere else, chariots and horsemen and ships. Just this once, with the king of the north. Oh, notice something else. He didn't say ships at all, did he? He said many ships. He didn't say many chariots. He didn't say many horsemen. He just said many ships. That's what the prophecy of Daniel says. And the only conclusion that we can reach is that the king of the north will have a very significant naval force, and that he will deploy it in his attack at the time of the end. That's the testimony of the prophecy of Daniel, you see. Now that flies in the face of the reality of Russian naval power in recent times, because after the fall of the USSR, Russian naval power declined absolutely dramatically. If you'd looked at Russian naval power a decade ago or 2 decades ago, you would have said, well, there's no possible way that the prophecy could be fulfilled. Russia hasn't got a naval power. She's got a few creaky old vessels, and there's no way she's going to conquer anything. But you see, the interesting thing is that as Christadelphians, we don't base our beliefs on current economic or political or military circumstances, but what the Scripture requires. And that's one of the things, by the way, about Signs of the Times nights and current events days, is the last thing we want to do is look at the current events and then find a scripture to suit. No. We do it the other way round. We establish our biblical framework first, and then we look to see what might or might not be happening in terms of world events. Now, Brother Thomas was an excellent exponent of this, because Brother Thomas wrote of many things where actually the world at the time didn't match up with what he said is going to happen. Brother Thomas says it doesn't matter. That's what the Bible says. If that's what the Bible says, that's what's going to happen. Now, let me show you an astounding example of Brother Thomas's writing with regard to this very matter of the Russian naval power, because I think this is a fascinating extract from Exposition of Daniel. So he says this about Daniel 11. He says, "But before this can be accomplished, these words to Daniel must be fulfilled, and the king of the north shall rush on like a tempest against him with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and overwhelm and pass over." So Brother Thomas said that before all these things can happen, this particular verse has got to be brought to fulfillment. And he said he will rush on against him both by land and sea, his force being distinguished by their numerical strength in chariots or artillery, cavalry and ships. The result of this tornado will be a successful one, for he will overwhelm and pass over. See, Brother Thomas read that the king of the north comes with many ships and he will overwhelm. So he says, well, if he overwhelms, then he must be successful. If he's successful, then the naval power is sufficient to accomplish that. It matters not whether it's here right now, but that's what's going to happen, says Brother Thomas. But look at what he then says. Oh, this is the interesting bit, brothers and sisters. This is biblical thinking, you see. Proper scriptural thinking. So Brother Thomas said this: all the Western European world prophesies the impossibility of the king of the north doing anything with his ships against the combined fleets of the Little Horn's allies. But to overwhelm and to pass over is to prevail. He has only to bide his time and to look out for eventualities. So when Brother Thomas wrote Exposition of Daniel, the power of British shipping, the Allies, was so dominant that he said there's no possible way that the king of the north can come with many ships and accomplish anything at all. But he said, that's what Daniel says. So he says, Russia only has to bide his time and look out for eventualities. Oh, I love that expression, brothers and sisters, eventualities. Isn't that a delicious, delightful word? Eventualities. It's what politicians are always looking for. Eventualities. Well, it was a remarkably prescient comment that Brother Thomas made. And I'll tell you why. Because Brother Thomas didn't just say the king of the north will look to spot an eventuality. Brother Thomas says, I can tell you exactly where he will spot the eventuality in order that this very verse might be fulfilled. And you never guess what he said. He said this. He said, complications will doubtless arise in the West which may divert attention from the Euxine. This diversion will be Russia's opportunity. And when seized, the movement of the king of the north will answer to the full force of the prophetic word. What Brother Thomas means is that when Russia comes forth, she will have the many ships required by the prophecy. And what he's really saying is the key to the development of a navy which can control the Mediterranean lies in the Euxine Sea. Oh, that's interesting because, well, you see, because it is. Do you know there are 5 naval operations that Russia has? The Northern Fleet, the Russian Baltic Fleet, the Russian Pacific Fleet, the Caspian Flotilla, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet. But the Black Sea is the only fleet that can possibly develop a naval presence in the Mediterranean. course, the Black Sea is the modern name for the Euxine Sea. Brother Thomas says, look out for something in the Black Sea. That's how Daniel 11 verse 40 will be outworked. Wait for an eventuality, he says, Russia will. Well, that eventuality described by Brother Thomas occurred, didn't it? Just a few years ago, and Russia seized the moment. The year was 2014, and the world was distracted by the Winter Olympics, and Putin was in Sochi, just south of a little area called the Crimea. Do you know the games finished on the 23rd of February 2014? And while the whole world was looking at the Winter Games, Russia had 6,000 troops moving into the Crimea, and 3 weeks later, on the 17th of March 2014, Crimea was gone, lost to the Russians. While all the world was looking the other way, Russia spotted an eventuality in the Euxine Sea and took their chance, you see. Isn't that interesting? In fact, I'll just pull you back to a slightly larger map, you see. So here it is. So she took control of that whole region. She brought troops across from here, from Russia, straight across into the Crimea, and within 3 weeks, Crimea had been annexed. And one of the really interesting things is that what that did, amongst other things, was it brought back into Russian control the port facility of Sevastopol, which they had been leasing from Ukraine. You know what the Russians paid to lease that single port from the Ukraine? $100 million a year to lease that one port. And they did it on the basis that the Ukraine government had to authorise every single thing that the Russians would bring into Sevastopol, down to the last cartridge or shell. And suddenly, the Russians owned it. No 100 million payment anymore. And it gave them control of the passage through to the Sea of Azov and back into Russia itself. Now that was a dramatic development, you see, brothers and sisters. Oh, and just notice one thing. Sevastopol. Well, of course you realise that's Cursidis Historica, where the Romans had their old naval facility. The very same spot is the very one that Russia took control of in 2014. Well, guess what happened in 2014? Do you know that in the 20 years, more than 20 years, between 1991 and 2014, only one combat ship was added to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. One ship. 23 years, one ship. The moment they took the Crimea, 2014, since 2014, it says the fleet has received 6 new Project 636 submarines, 3 Admiral Grigorovich class frigates. The Black Sea will receive 6 Vasily Baikov class corvettes, 6 Boyan class missile ships, and 6 Karakurt small missile ships, all equipped with caliber land attack missiles. Suddenly the Black Sea Fleet is growing at a rapid rate, all since the taking of Crimea. Those last ones, by the way, these little missile ships called Karakurt. That name in the Russian is named after a species of black widow spider whose bite is lethal. The reason why they called those missile ships Karakurts or Black Widows is because of this. They've got caliber missile systems on them that have a range and a precision so powerful that they could destroy every single European NATO asset and military installation off those little boats. And Russia seized your opportunity. It's happened in our time, brothers and sisters, just back a few years, you see. Remarkable, really. And have a look at the map and see whether this makes sense. The focus, they said, in this particular report, which was 2018, is that the Black Sea Fleet will assume the role of primary supplier of ships to the Russian Mediterranean squadron. Well, of course it will, brothers and sisters. It's the only place they can do it from, which was why that annexation of Crimea was so significant. that annexation occurred so that Daniel 11 verse 40 can take place. And in fact, if we went to a map of the Mediterranean again, but this time not under the Romans but under the Russians, what you'll find is this. Well, they've got Sebastopol. They have another port over there. They have a port down in Syria, in the same place more or less where the Romans had a port facility. And they're also negotiating ports. They're talking with Cyprus, they're talking about a port in Alexandria, they're talking about a possible port in Homs, which are almost, in each of those cases, the very spots where Romans once had a navy. They may even consider negotiating with Algiers. And suddenly we realise that Russia has so transformed things that the Mediterranean now looks like a Russian lake, in much the same way that once it was a Roman lake, and that Bible prophecy is being outworked here, unbeknownst to the nations. It's all happening, you see, in accordance with our biblical expectations. So just another article about that, which says, and I only draw your attention to just that one key word, they're interested in the establishment of a permanent Russian naval presence in the region. It has a powerful naval force permanently deployed in this region. We see that's exactly what we'd expect, isn't it, brothers and sisters? This is all in accordance with our prophetical understandings. And we know that from a biblical perspective, much of that will be successful, because when Russia does come down and does come into the land of Israel, we're going to see Russian deportations from Israel. Those of Zechariah chapter 4 that will go forth into captivity. Those of Joel chapter 3 that will be sold unto the Grecians from the coast of Palestina. Those in Isaiah chapter 11 that will have to be gathered back to the land, having been dispersed at this terrible time. Oh yes, there'll be deportations. And how will those deportations occur? They'll occur on ships, by ships, from the coasts, because of the presence of a Russian navy in that particular region. But the thing is, brothers and sisters, if you're still in Daniel chapter 11, the reality is, as verse 45 says, is that all of this is bound to fail. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. It can't succeed, because God intends that it shall not. And we knew of that, incidentally, the failure of this navy, long before Daniel chapter 11 ever prophesied it to be so. Because if you come to the book of Numbers and chapter 24, there was a much, much older prophecy than the book of Daniel that said that this naval power of the Russians would meet their doom in the Middle East. You'll remember that Numbers 24 and verses 23 and 24 read as follows. It says, he took up his parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God doeth this? And ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and shall afflict Ashur, and shall afflict Eber, and he also shall perish forever. Now, incidentally, the initial fulfillment of that verse most probably occurred when the Romans conquered Israel and eastward toward the territories of Syria and Iraq and Iran. In fact, the Vulgate translates this little phrase, ships shall come from the coast of Kittim. It says in the Latin, venient in tribus de Italia, which means they shall come in triremes from Italy, a reference to the Roman warships. And certainly the phrase ships of Kittim here referred to the Roman navy in Daniel chapter 11 verse 30, as we've already seen. But the Dead Sea Scrolls mention Kittim as well. And the Nahum commentary of the Dead Sea Scrolls refers to the kings of Greece from Antiochus until the rise of the rulers of Kittim, it says. And it was the Romans who followed the Greeks, and this reference to Kittim in the Dead Sea Scrolls we take also to be a reference to the Roman power. So there was a Roman fulfillment, no doubt, of this prophecy, but there's another one to come. There has to be another final fulfillment, because you see, whereas in verse 20 Amalek would be the first of the nations to war against Israel, as the margin suggests. The power of verse 24 will be the last nation to war against them. And this phrase, ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, answers to Daniel 11 verse 40. The king of the north shall come, and many ships with him. And in afflicting ancient Ashur, this last power also becomes the king of the north. But his end, says the prophecy, is that he also shall perish forever. And so as it was prophesied of Amalek in verse 20, his latter end shall be that he shall perish forever, so now the power of the ships of Kittim shall perish forever. And that promise, brothers and sisters, matches Daniel 11 verse 45, doesn't it? Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Balaam had already said that this endeavour would come to naught. And I think, brothers and sisters, that we have a prophecy of the overthrow of the Russian Navy in the book of Isaiah in chapter 33. It's most certainly not the first part of the fulfilment, but it's most probably the last, you see. Whatever earlier fulfilments the book of Isaiah might have had in its 33rd chapter, I think there's something that will refer us to the time of the end, consistent with our examination tonight or this afternoon about the Russian naval power. See how verse 1 begins? Isaiah 33 verse 1. Woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled, and dealest treacherously, and they dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. And when thou shalt make an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. So you see, the opening verse sets the whole context for the chapter. It's about the time when the spoiler of Israel is overthrown. But there's been many spoilers down through time. But where's the last spoiler of Israel who shall be dealt with and spoiled? Well, the answer is verse 19. Isaiah 33 verse 19 says, Thou shalt not see a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech than thou canst perceive, of a stammering tongue that thou canst not understand. So here then is the final destiny of the king of fierce countenance. These words are an allusion to the prophecy of Deuteronomy chapter 28. They were brought against God's people to execute God's judgments. But when that purpose is accomplished, they themselves shall be judged. So what we've got really in this chapter is a prophecy of the fall of the fierce nation. So here it is, brothers and sisters, Deuteronomy 28, the nation of fierce countenance with a tongue thou shalt not understand. Daniel 8, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences. And now Isaiah 33, a fierce people thou shalt not see, a people of too deep a lip to understand, of too barbarous a tongue to comprehend. See what Rotherham says? That fierce people thou shalt not see. Or, again, as the New International Version says, you will see those arrogant people no more, those people of an obscure speech with their strange, incomprehensible tongue. And the reason why they would see them no more, brothers and sisters, is because they were going to be removed. This is the promise of their final removal, that they will never see a king of fierce countenance ever again, because it will all be over when God finally moves to rescue and save his people. So verse 20 says, Look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken. But there the glorious Yahweh will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams, wherein shall no galley with oars, neither shall gallant ship pass by. So the interesting thing is that the overthrow of the adversary and the spoiling of the spoiler in this chapter is not couched in military terms, but in naval ones. The word galley there is the root word of the word for ships in Daniel 11 verse 40. King of the north shall come with many ships. And the word ships there in verse 21 is the same word for ships in Numbers 24 verse 24 and Daniel chapter 11 verse 30. This is a promise that the final naval power of the king of fierce countenance will be overthrown by Almighty God. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, says verse 22. He will save us. And in doing so, verse 23 says, thy tacklings are loosed. They could not well strengthen the mast. They could not spread the sail. Then is the prey of a great spoil divided, and the lame take the prey. So here is the breaking of the naval power of the spoiler. You see that word sail in verse 23? It's the same word translated ensign in Isaiah 11 verse 12. It doesn't just mean a sail, it can also mean a flag. It's like the sail of a ship. An ensign flag that flies on a boat. You'd never guess what the ensign of the Russian Navy is, would you? The last one to be removed. When all of this is overthrown in the providence of God. That's the Russian naval flag. The last fierce king who comes from afar with a tongue too deep to understand, and who flies as swift as the eagle, will be gone. And then is the prey of a great spoil divided, and the lame shall take the prey. This is when the spoiler is spoiled, and God will move to save his people and exalt the nation of Israel to their proper place, to become the focal point of all the world. We've always said, haven't we, brothers and sisters, that the Bible has tomorrow's news today. But how privileged we are to read such newspapers ahead of their time. See, as Bible students, we're not surprised at these naval developments in the Mediterranean. We expected them. But what they teach is that the advent of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom are close and they are certain. That God has all things under his control and that these events are moving swiftly towards their conclusion. We can have confidence, brothers and sisters, that what God has promised, he not only can, but he will most certainly perform. And as verse 20 envisages it, brothers and sisters, the promise is that there will be a kingdom centred in Israel with its capital centred in Jerusalem. And we can believe that all of this will take place, brothers and sisters, and the king of fierce countenance will forever be gone, and the curses against Israel will be lifted, that there might be only blessing to come. How thankful we are for the more sure word of prophecy, and for a time when Christ shall come and have dominion from sea to sea.